Welcome everyone to this edition of Mwango Spaces on this very cool, very calm night here in Nairobi. Clear skies all around. And for once, we're not dealing with inclement weather. No crazy rains, no intense flooding. It's a relatively good place to be at the moment. Over the next hour, we're going to be working on a conversation that sort of relates to what we've just spoken about. The question around climate finance. Up and down across the continent, we see it in our homes, when we travel across the country, when we travel across the continent. Weather conditions are becoming a lot more interesting, shall we say. With droughts, when they do come, they're a lot more frequent. They hit a lot harder. When the rains do come, they're also a lot more intense. We're swinging into more extreme ends of that spectrum of the sort of weather we can expect. The bigger question for us, especially here in Africa, is how exactly do we cope with this more inclement weather? How do farmers adjust? How do we find ways of adjusting the way we move not just ourselves, but our goods and our transport around the continent and around the country? We'll explore, of course, how to pay for all of these things and the ways in which we can pull that off and the policy measures that are needed to support that in detail with my panelists. Tonight, we have Senator Moses Kajwang. He's a senator for Holler Bay, and he's also the convener of the Senate Climate Change Caucus. Also with us, Peter Odengo, the head of climate finance and green economy at the National Treasury. He's also the program coordinator at the institute. You'll see there with a very interesting acronym, FLLoCA. What exactly does that mean? The short version is that essentially it's financing for locally led climate action. He'll explain in detail exactly what it is they do. Gentlemen, welcome to this space. Thank you for your time. We certainly don't take it for granted. Senator, I want to start with you. Give us a short introduction of your background and what you've been doing in the climate finance space.
Thank you very much. Coming from the legislature, one might think that we are just observers when it comes to issues of climate finance. The FLLoCA program, which my friend Peter oversees, the money that goes to county governments goes as a conditional grant. In other words, Parliament must approve the portion of grant that goes to county governments, and thereafter Parliament does the oversight and make sure that the projects are done and that the investments constitute value for money. Beyond approving the conditional grants collectively as Parliament, we have also established a small team of climate champions. That is what you're calling the Senate Climate Change Caucus. It's actually not just the Senate, it includes the National Assembly. One of the things we realized is that climate change and climate science is not something that everyone is born with knowledge on. Of course, everyone experiences floods. Everyone experiences all these changes and vagaries that we associate with climate change. But not all of us understand the science behind it. Not all of us understand the legislation and the policy around it. So we sat down as members of Parliament and realized that this is such a specialized subject that we need to build a team of champions who can be eloquent in talking about it and who can be champions in ensuring that legislation is properly aligned. That's how we came up with this focus. One of the things that the Kenyan Parliament has done ahead of most of the other parliaments in Africa is that we had the first climate change pact. And that was way back in 2016. And Kenya was the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to have that. And that only happens when members of Parliament understand the science, the policy, and the facts behind the climate change. Fast forward, Kenya hosted the Africa Climate Summit. And around that time, the Kenyan Parliament made amendments to the Climate Change Act to mainstream issues of carbon markets and carbon trading. So as a convener of the Climate Change Caucus in the Senate, my job is to bring together people who are passionate about this subject and then expose them to subject matter experts and also take them to global events like the Conference of Parties so that they can network and understand what their peers in the legislatures in other countries are doing. So broadly, as a background, that's what we do. I know many Kenyans know me for public finance management oversight. But I also lead this team of champions who are passionate about legislation, policy, and science on climate change. And I think it has been very useful because Kenya seems to have one of the most progressive legislative frameworks when it comes to climate change and our focus on adaptation and mitigation. And that is why every year Parliament approves billions of shillings to go to county governments through the County Allocation of Revenue Act, which disburses conditional grants to county governments. Thank you.
We'll certainly get into the details of what those grants do. Are they effective? What is working? What is not? A little later. Peter, I want to come to you. FLLoCA. Tell us about FLLoCA and your role in it. What exactly does it do for the tens of millions of Kenyans around the country?
Thank you very much, Ramanyang. FLLoCA is an acronym which means financing locally led climate action program, which is designed primarily to respond to adaptation component of the climate change. That means about 80% of the resources goes to that. My role in FLLoCA is a designer, a philosophy holder, a theory and the principle on how climate finance can respond to the local scenario led by the local people, proposed by the local people, and that FLLoCA is pretty much about the principle which we have seen all for the last 30 to 35 years after the science had already proved that the earth is warming and that the warming of the earth is causing catastrophic effects to especially vulnerable, poor communities living in far-fetched areas where conventional development cannot reach, public finance cannot respond to their needs. The knowledge that is given within the conference of parties, within the international headquarters, does not resonate with what they know at the local level, because indigenous people living with disabilities, children, very old people, women, are always excluded in many decision making. It is upon this background that in 2019, we decided, after conducting several studies, which indicated that Kenya will always lose between 1 to 3% of our annual GDP to the effects of climate change if nothing has happened. Now, this, compared with what has been going on globally before, that you find almost 70 to 80% of the climate finance was responding to mitigation. Mitigation in climate landscape simply means, in a layman language, my grandmother's language, measures that are reducing emission of greenhouse gases, which is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrogen, and others, which is in the atmosphere. A result of the neglect of this side of the coin, where the communities are supposed to adapt to the impacts that we know, yet the total climate finance flowing to them, compared with 2014, where almost 1.1 trillion of climate finance was available globally, less than 30% went to adaptation. And within that 30%, 90% did not go to the local community. It is upon this background that we said FLLoCA should now be designed with the people in mind and give them three things. One, decision on what they want to do with the resources. Two, give them the grant and the power to select what adaptive capacity they need. And finally, to propose and select based on their local knowledge on how to respond to climate change impacts, because many people, you and I, and Honorable Kajuan, my friend, we have tried the other sides, we have tried with policies, we have tried with strategies, we have tried the action plans. We were not achieving resilience to the local communities. That is why we formed it. At the coordinator, I ensure that the local community's capacity is built. The national government's capacity is strengthened in terms of deriving the policy, right from the parliamentarians, where we are working closely with the caucus, the Kajuan's team, the Senate, and the judiciary that is supposed to adjudicate matters of riparian lands, the institutions, universities, the media, the groups, and all is included. No one should be left behind, and no one should pull us behind.
Just before I get into our next focus area, Peter, could you give us an example of two things that you've just spoken about? Because as you say, we can talk about climate finance at policy level here in Nairobi, or we can talk about this at COP30. But what is it that you actually hear when you go to the ground, when you're in Siaya, when you are in parts of Marsabit or Mandera, or you go to Nyeri? What do local communities who are facing extremely brutal droughts, like what we had in 2022, what do they say they actually want for climate finance? What do they want climate finance to do in mitigation and adaptation?
Local people want simple things which resonate very well with daily livelihood and support system. Number one, they want water. Climate change, a warming earth results into less water because of high herbal transpiration, so it is less. Two, they want food systems because climate change affects productivity of our land, the local land, because local people, majority of them cannot afford the fertilizers, cannot afford all the chemicals. But remember, also those chemicals are causing the degradation of the environment. So they want what we call better climate smart agriculture. These people want to restore their degraded ecosystems their forests, their river waters, which they use to get their livelihood system. They want to protect their lakes where they get fish. They want to protect their pastures where their livestock is getting their fodder, because that is their livelihood. They also want to be aware and to be part and parcel of the decision making on matters that affect them. They do not want to be informed of decisions of the Washington, D.C., London, Nairobi, Cape Town, or in any case, Kisumu, where I come from. They want to be part and parcel. It is on this, and they also want to respond to the little things, for example, indoor air pollution, which affects millions of women and children because of the type of the energy that is available for them within our traditional African household. They also want that culture, which they were born of, should also be part and parcel of the measures of adaptation to a warming earth, mitigating the emissions which are causing warming. They also want that their health system, which has been negatively impacted as a result of warmer earth. The people of Mount Kenya, where there was no malaria because mosquitoes could not survive in cooler habitats. Yet, as a result of climate change, the melting of the snows, there are now mosquitoes there. They do not have coping mechanisms like the people of the lake region, the people of the coastal region where it has. So they need the special attention. The coastal region with their coral reefs, they want to preserve them because that is what gives them the tourism. The people of Narok want their wildlife to survive. So these are what they want. But over and above, they want resources to respond to this because they did not cause the mess that they are in today.
Indeed. How should we be thinking about climate finance today? Because I think for the average man on the street, we say, okay, we need climate finance to do X, Y, Z. We need to invest in a lot more renewable power and interventions of that sort. And they think, well, this is sounds a little esoteric to me, doesn't necessarily resonate with me. How are you and your colleagues in the National Assembly and the Senate thinking about using the fiscal policy in this country to drive climate finance?
One of the unique designs of the FLLoCA, which we have looked at in Parliament, is that the solutions are locally led. And I think that's why even on Go for Global events, FLLoCA seems to be the poster project for Kenya when it comes to the climate space. Because we're allowing local communities to decide what is it that they want to invest in for adaptation or for mitigation. So you will go to a county and go to a ward because the decision making has been sent to the ward level. In the ward, they might decide that they want a dam. In another ward, they might decide they want a small-scale irrigation project. In another ward, they could decide that they want a biogas solution. So it is the community that then decides the investments or the interventions that they want to undertake, rather than the World Bank or the funders being the ones to decide. I think that was the uniqueness in the structure of FLLoCA that has made it a success and that has made it something that is being emulated by other countries.
I'm just going to give a bit of brief background here as we try and get the senator back online. Just a bit of background on how FLLoCA is working at a national scale and exactly the sort of money that's involved in this specific program. So there's $150 million that's coming through from the World Bank through IDA, which is essentially one of their funding facilities that they have. There's another $75 million coming through from the Kenyan government, effectively from taxpayers like you and I. There's another $62 million in total, and that's coming from a range of entities. There's KfW, the German Development Financing Unit, co-financing from Denmark, Netherlands, and Sweden as well. So all in, you're looking at a relatively large pot of cash, totaling almost around $300 million, with around 9 counties at least meeting the conditions needed to get access to a lot of this financing and to then deploy it in the way that the senator was talking about earlier. Peter, if I may come to you just for a moment, what is the cost of inaction as you see it? Because I know you've been in the environment and climate financing space for quite a while, and we're facing more intense droughts, more frequent droughts, more intense rainfall when it does come. What is the economic cost of inaction? Because one of the arguments that I often run into in this space is the individuals will say, yeah, but why are we spending money on climate finance when we've got competing, quote unquote, spending priorities in education or healthcare or agriculture? So walk us through that thought process there. What is the economic cost of doing nothing?
Economic cost of doing nothing is equivalent with destruction of the entire humanity, destruction of no economic growth at all, stagnation of all what we have. Because, for example, when the agricultural systems collapse as a result of climate change, prolonged drought, all, including the insects, the birds, trees, die, and without an ecosystem, definitely our water catchments will not be there. Most of the people here know very well that Kenyan economy is agro-based or natural-based economy. Climate change affects and inflicts the natural resources. In 2009, to show the magnitude of the cause of no inaction, according to the Strathmore Environment Institute, which undertook the economics of climate change in Kenya, which gave us at the minimum that the cost of inaction, we will lose between 2 to 4% of our GDP annually if we don't respond as a country. Now, if you look at the annual economic growth within the country and within the Africa, it averages between 3 to 6%. In fact, it was only Rwanda which had some 7% and Kenya during the other time. But now, if you look, at least 4% of the economic growth or gains is lost as a result of inaction of not responding to climate change, then it means that annually you can only have 1 or 2% of the economic growth. But now look at our population growth of 3.4% and look at the demand of the infrastructure. So the cost of inaction is so immense that the investment that we have, for example, the Kenya Ports Authority, which is at the coast of Mombasa, one of the impact of climate change is the ocean level rising. If the ocean level rises along Mombasa to 1 meter, as predicted, if mitigation measures are not taken, then it means that the port of Mombasa will now sink and the coastline will be involved, for example. Now you will lose all the incomes that we have, for example, in that. We have lost snow in Mount Kenya, and you see how the river Tana and rivers are drying up. And look at the river economy.
We're going to try and get Peter back on the call because we've lost his audio at the moment. Senator Kajwang, with respect to the question around climate finance inflows, because as a government, we've put in the work in terms of trying to get capital to come into this market, to fund some of the things that you've spoken about a little earlier, right? These locally led initiatives, which will clearly vary from one point to another. But a common problem that I always see at COP29, COP30, the complaint is always that if there is climate financing available, not much of it actually comes into the African continent. Is that a problem that you also see?
That is a real problem. What we're talking about right now, FLLoCA, funds that have been sourced from the World Bank, the Swedish government, the Danes, the Dutch, and the Germans. But the bulk of money for climate finance in the global space sits with bodies like GCF, the Green Climate Fund, which I was happy to note a week or two back, Kenya won the bid to host the headquarters for Africa. So at least we'll be having the GCF in Nairobi. Perhaps it will make it much easier for us to access financing from the GCF. You have the Adaptation Fund. You've got the Loss and Damage Fund, which was right at, I think it was a COP in Dubai, if not the one in Sharm el-Sheikh. It is very difficult to access money from this fund, L&D Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the GCF. In fact, we've been able to access some little money from the Green Climate Fund, but it has been very limited amounts, money that has been used for capacity building of members of parliament and other players within the space. It is called the Readiness Fund. But by and large, it is very difficult to access. And it's a common conversation, not just for countries in the global south. I think it's a common conversation across all countries that, yes, we go for COPs, you make commitments. And first of all, the money that countries commit does not get remitted to the bodies, with the US having pulled out of the climate change or science and policy and lobby. It has opened up a huge deficit when it comes to financing. However, the little that is there is also not being accessed by developing countries. And we are saying we need to simplify the access mechanisms to some of those resources. And part of that conversation is by moving those quotas closer to the global south. And as I said, GCF is coming to Nairobi. Now, when it comes to the funds that come into the country, again, if it's left at the center, very little of it trickles down to the grassroots. And that's why, as I said earlier, the design of FLLoCA, we feel as if it was different from your normal donor-funded programs, where the ministry goes and talks to the World Bank or talks to the Danes and the Dutch. They get money, and then the bulk of that money remains in Nairobi for capacity building. And then the ministry is the one that decides on what should go down to the grassroots. So this was a bottom-up approach that FLLoCA brought in that brings greater accountability, has a bigger impact. The question is, why should we ring-fence climate finance? And yet, whatever you do from a climate adaptation mitigation perspective is still within the spectrum of development. The reason that I would give is this. If you give the governors an opportunity to use the 400 billion that the Senate sends to them every other year, they would pay salaries, and it would be politically sound for them to invest in shiny things. Shiny things would be the roads, the stadia, the hospitals, the markets, brick and mortar that can be seen. Very few of them would want to prioritize things like wetlands, river ecosystems, forests, renewable cooking, or stormwater management. You have seen in a county like Nairobi, whenever it rains heavily, we have these floods. And sometimes we're told that the flooding is just due to simple things around stormwater management, solid waste management that we are not doing properly. So in my view, it makes sense to ring-fence a certain percentage of a county's resources, even a country's resources, so that it is specifically tailored and directed towards adaptation and mitigation measures. Because if we don't do, then we will be tempted just to build highways. We will be tempted just to build airports and railways without looking at the small things that can sink the ship.
Before I turn to Peter, Senator, looking at the current global economic and political environment we're in at the moment, because in successive COPs, we've been having arguments around providing money. The Loss and Damages Fund, I think there were pledges for about $700 million that were put in there last year, which, strictly speaking, given the scale of the need, is a drop in the ocean. It doesn't really go that far. Shouldn't countries like us be thinking about how can we finance the bulk of our mitigation and adaptation needs with domestic resources rather than asking other countries to pay for it?
That has been an argument in previous COPs. But remember also there's the polluter pays principle. Africa, Kenya is bearing the brunt of climate change, and yet we are not the ones responsible. We negotiate as Africa, G77, including China. We are saying that we are not the originators of this mess. There are countries that have become rich, excessively rich, through activities that have polluted and messed up the climate for everybody else. They have a moral obligation. It is not charity. It is an obligation that they need. It's almost like reparations for the damage that they have caused to other parts of the world. So that is a strong and firm basis that Africa has held on to. That yes, in as much as we should mobilize domestic financing, but most of the problems you're facing are not of our own making. In any case, many African countries, like Kenya, we are at net zero. That what we emit, we are able to absorb it. So it's easy for us to clean our hands and fold our hands and say that we're at net zero, so we should not be part of this conversation. But every day we are seeing those effects coming from the global emitters, the global polluters. And that's why we are holding them at a higher level of responsibility and accountability. We have said it clearly that climate finance should never be looked at from the prism of charity. Nonetheless, domestically, we must also make commitments. Now, what FLLoCA has done is that from the grant that goes to counties, each county government is also obliged to set aside a matching amount towards the county climate change fund. So it's not just the money coming from the World Bank alone, but as a result of this structure, we are, for every 1 shilling that the World Bank and these other donors put in, we are also mobilizing at least 1 shilling. And I'm saying at least because there are some counties that for every 1 shilling coming from the grant, they are able to match 2 or 3 shillings for climate change and for climate mitigation measures. So yes, we must think about our own capacity. We must make sure that the National Climate Change Fund is also established, because that's also something that we haven't been able to do. The Climate Change Act required us to have a climate change fund at the national level. And that climate change fund would have had receipts from various taxes, various fiscal pronouncements. Like now we have set up the infrastructure fund. And we're saying when we sell corporations, we'll be putting money in that infrastructure fund. There are countries that have even come up with carbon taxes, which then those taxes go into the climate change fund. So that we have not been able to do, but the National Treasury has been fairly successful in being able to convince donors to put in money, which then they manage and disburse to counties. All our counties, each of the 47 counties, have now established a climate change fund, and they are matching whatever is coming from the donors, 1 shilling to 1 shilling, and some counties have even gone ahead. But climate finance should never be seen as charity. There are people who have messed up the global climate, and they have a responsibility and a moral obligation to pay. And we know the US, being one of the biggest emitters, has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. But the beauty of the American system is that every 4 years you have an election. And so we hope that in their next round of election, they'll make the right decisions, because we cannot be climate denialists. The science is there. Every year, they are telling us kind of mess that we are facing as a globe. And then easy for politicians to say that it's a hoax. But the science is there. We must be driven and convinced by science.
Peter, I want to bring you back into the conversation here. From a national treasury perspective, how should we be thinking about climate finance, climate mitigation and adaptation, and how we essentially use fiscal policy to achieve those goals? Because at face value, it looks like there's relatively low-hanging fruit in things like urban planning. For example, we don't have enough green spaces in Nairobi. We're busy building beacon to beacon, for example, creating heat islands in certain parts of the city. And it's certainly something that you see in other parts of the country as well. So how should we be thinking about embedding these ideas into our fiscal planning from the very start?
The public finance is designed in a very interesting triangular kind of a moving corners. All over the world, national treasuries and ministries of finance have got serious challenges, because the sources of funds, which is going to the public, are for what is grant. And over the last 10, 15 years, grant has been declining significantly. Number 2 is debt. You need to get debt to finance the public good. You hear very well that counties like Kenya, a number of them are already at debt cliff. Any small slide, the entire economy collapse, because the debt to the GDP ratio must not be more than 50%. The other one is philanthropy. These are the things, small-scale NGOs-based support, which is within. Then, now, when you get that between the debt, grant, revenue, philanthropy, and taxes. So now the taxes is now what gets you the revenue. So all these parameters, when you put in the climate change, we now see that climate risk increases the shrinking of the economy. And the National Treasury now have to look outside the traditional ways of getting finance, which is from those 4 climate finance, which is defined as finances that come from local, national, and international, which is drawn from public, private, and alternative sources, need to support the shrinking physical space that developing countries are facing, just as the Honorable Senator has just mentioned. So continuously, the economic growth globally is infringed by the global economic challenges. But now when it is coupled with the impact of climate change, then the fiscal space now shrinks further. So it means that national treasuries and ministers of finance have to explore other alternative ways through which they can now support the public budget. Climate finance is that one which is handy, because the counties under the UNFCCC had committed that they need to support the developing countries by providing additional resources. And one of the conditions under the convention was that the climate finance must be accessible, must be mobilized in scale, and must reach the last mile where it is. The developed countries should provide climate finance to support the less fortunate, most vulnerable countries of climate change, to provide that money. So we have to move, and that is why the financing locally led climate action has been its domicile in the National Treasury, because it is a financing mechanism that now demonstrates to the global financial systems, capital markets authorities, carbon credits, normal development assistance, which have been declining, that there is a mechanism that is working. Because whenever we go to the COPs, whenever we go to the international meetings, the argument was counties have got no capacity, one, to develop bankable project proposal, In Kenya and in Tanzania, we have demonstrated that. They say absorption, you cannot get money, they will not absorb. In the National Treasury, the FLLoCA, the little money which you are talked about, which is about 325 million US dollars, for the past phase of 5 years, it's a drop in the ocean. If you look at our NDC, National Determined Contribution, up to 2030, Kenya is supposed to mobilize at least $62 billion. Now, the mobilization of that $62 billion is rested within the National Treasury. But within this is local contribution and international contribution. The domestic resources is quite significant because you cannot leave your citizens to be swept away, like where Nairobi was left to be swept away by floods. It is only Nairobi which was swept by floods because they could not respond to the local actions. And you see the impact today because of reconstructing the mess in Nairobi during the last floods is over 50 billion. But now, given that climate change, every 5 years or 2 years, there is a flood. Every 2 years or 3 years, there is drought. And now when you get them, then any gains that has been made there, then will be swept away by the swept infrastructure. No road, no bridges, diseases. So it is upon this background that the National Treasury have come up with significant mechanism. Number one, FLLoCA, to demonstrate that adaptation is business. Number two, it also had come up with green fiscal incentive to attract the private sector because the wage need, the government alone, your tax alone cannot. So we need the private sector to come in. And for the private sector to come in, you need an incentive, enabling environment to show them that there is a working system.
With respect to incentives, should we try something along the lines of what Rwanda and Ethiopia have done in terms of nudging the market towards buying more hybrids, more electric vehicles? Because in Ethiopia, clearly it's worked out quite well for them. They've got over 100,000 EVs roaming around on their roads. Rwanda has got even an EV assembly plant as well. Are those policies we should be thinking about? Because ultimately we say some of these things not be financed directly from our pockets as taxpayers. But there are those tax measures that we can put into the fiscus that essentially nudge the market. Where any of our listeners, Juma G, for example, can go into the market and say she's got a budget of $10,000. She wants to buy a car. And if an EV is cheaper and newer and it has a lower economic footprint and an environmental footprint, we nudge in that direction. Those are the things we should be doing as well, no?
Perfect. The Green Fiscal Policy Incentive Framework 2024, passed by the Honorable Parliament, is there. And those are the areas that we are moving towards. For example, now, there is a scrappaging where the old cars are supposed to be returned and then people get a rebate and also exemption for a period of that time. You have seen the electric buses doing very good rounds on roads of Nairobi. Just last year, the Green Climate Fund approved Kenya is among one of them, $220 million US dollars for e-mobility, and more are coming in. We are moving towards that. But that alone is not enough. There are areas where we need to be so much pragmatic. A country like China, which by 1992 was being considered a third world country, at that time it was US that was emitting more than 25% of the global greenhouse gases. Today it is China that is emitting even more than the US. It is China that is leading in the renewable energies. But we still treat China as a developing country and we import. We need methods where any investment from the Chinese, part of it should be a direct G to G, government to government, carbon tax and carbon rebate, so that the SDR should not be a locomotive SDR. A country like Kenya should negotiate to buy an electric train from China. They begin to buy a locomotive, but China should give electric train so that they reduce emission, so that we balance our books. It is what is called the smart climatic response. So if we go that way, we will fix our green trajectory emission.
I want to get to some questions that are coming in from our listeners. I want to start with one here from IPF, directed at you, Senator Kajwan, and asking how can authorities in government essentially strengthen coordination, especially in monitoring, right, all these multiple funds that are coming up at county level? Because they're saying some counties have FLLoCA, county climate funds, they have disaster funds, they've got emergency funds, and these exist in silos with less accountability, since some MCAs do not even know about them and they do not ask for quarterly reports as provided for by law. And they're saying they're basing this on a study that they did in 4 counties, in Tana River, Nairobi, Garissa, and Marsabit. Kajwan.
we still need to do some work to strengthen coordination. Just recently, the Senate has started doing a review of FLLoCA projects, investments, and impact across the counties. And I do also note that there are some counties that have established emergency funds, which sometimes do things that overlap. There's nothing wrong, because you've got some of these emergencies that happen in some of our counties, particularly the counties in northern Kenya. Sometimes it's easy to use emergency funds, maybe for flood mitigation, flood control, and all that. But yes, there's need to strengthen coordination, and that can only be done by tightening oversight. And the reason why we thought that FLLoCA is a trailblazer is that the projects are identified locally, but also accountability and oversight is local. When you come for the next budget cycle and you're telling the people that now we want to do something different, they will ask you, last year you said you're going to do a borehole here. Where is it? And if you're not able to satisfy them at that level, then rest assured that even that grant will not be allocated. And that is why it is a conditional grant, that you only get further disbursements on the basis that you met the original conditions. And I want to thank the National Treasury, because I think in about 2 or 3 cases, we have seen some counties that have been discontinued from the program. I think there was a problem in Nyamira, there was a problem in Kakamega, there could have been a problem in Kajiado. And in all those cases, the National Treasury has written to them, told them of the conditions that have been breached, and mandated that they take corrective measures before additional financial flows. But responding to IPF, we are not at 100% as far as coordination is concerned. I think it is still work in progress. And we believe that also at some point we'll be involving other partners, like the Office of the Auditor General, to do a proper value for money assessment. Yes, the people are saying this is what they want, but is it constituting value for money? We have seen some cases where the people have said they want tree nurseries. So you'll find tree nurseries have been set up, but at very exaggerated prices. Sometimes the National Treasury has no capacity to deal with that. They will take it as what the people have said. But the Auditor General can clearly tell that a tree nursery of 20 million should not be a roadside tree nursery. So we will move forward, and in my dual role as a climate champion and my dual role as a PFM champion, I see the potential of engaging other players to ensure there's value for money, not just at the county level, but even at the national level, as far as those investments are concerned.
That implies that we also do need to provide a bit more capital to the Auditor General, because if we're having them provide proper audit trails to cover more things beyond just looking at ministry accounts, SOE accounts, looking at things like project financing and FLLoCA and what exactly was done, they will need higher capital allocations, won't they?
I do agree. And one thing, again, I must applaud the Auditor General, because it's a conversation we've been having with them. They are setting up a specialized unit that can do audits, can do assessments on climate-related matters. And I think, as Peter was talking about some of the fiscal incentives, sometimes we feel like you can use fiscal policy to mobilize funds. You can also use fiscal policy to provide incentives. As far as the Auditor General is concerned, and the question that you have raised, we could use fiscal policy to incentivize the Office of the Auditor General. And perhaps there are some countries that have come up with green bonds, carbon taxes, environmental taxes. Some countries have even imposed a wealth tax that is then redirected towards climate change intervention, or energy and transport taxes, or penalties on pollution. Sometimes you need to find a way of making sure that the work of the Auditor General is not necessarily funded directly from the consolidated fund, but it is tied to certain deliverables. If the Auditor General is going to be an effective player, overseer of climate investments, perhaps a little bit of the taxes we raise on climate and pollution-related matters, we could have a portion of that going towards capacity building of institutions. Not just the Auditor General. Peter mentioned the judiciary. We've got a land and environment court that adjudicates over serious matters and matters that keep evolving. The Paris Agreement is fairly new, and I can tell you that when we even started our caucus, many members of parliament did not understand what the Paris Agreement meant, and yet it's supposed to be part of our national laws. The same case applies to the judiciary. So yes, we must think through a formula for incentivizing and building the capacity of institutions that sit at the crossroads of this climate change subject. The auditors, the judiciary, the legislators, the executives, and of the people who are involved in the locally led decisions.
I'm going to come to a question here. I'm going to put it to both of you, starting with you, Senator Kajong, but Peter, I want you also to come in on this a little later. Here's Hannah's question. She's asking, why are we selling carbon credits to companies outside Africa and then our companies buy from them? And the example she's giving here is Kenya Airways. And she's asking, what's the logic of this? Yet we have Kenyan companies in Kenya that can sell these carbon credits directly to companies here if they do need to offset their emissions.
That's an interesting concern. From a legislative perspective, the amendments to the Climate Change Act that gave further effect to carbon trading, we did that about 2 years ago when we hosted the Africa Climate Summit. Sometimes it's important for us to reflect and do a legislative impact assessment. Of course, the regulations came later. I think the regulations came 1 year later. And so perhaps that's something that we need to look at. I know that there have been certain local players like Northern Rangelands Trust that has been in the carbon trading and carbon market space for some time now, even before the regulations were gazetted. But the carbon market debate across Africa and even globally, whenever we go for the COPs, there are people who take this kind of argument, and sometimes I sympathize with them. You go for those meetings and they ask you, what is carbon? What color is it? What is its smell? Is it an object? And that is something that many people are still grappling with, such that the carbon markets globally seem to be tilted in favor of the people who did the policy at the global level. The price of carbon in Europe is different from the price of carbon in Africa, and yet it's supposed to be the same object. And so we usually have those conversations whenever we go for the COPs, where Africans are saying, if you cannot quantify this thing, identify this thing, tell its color and tell its smell, why then would you sell it differently in Europe and not in Africa? And perhaps part of the reason why the market or the buyers tend to be from global markets, perhaps is because you get a better return from there. But I still think that we need to do a proper legislative impact assessment. And those of us in Parliament, perhaps we must field these questions to the Cabinet Secretary responsible. And I can undertake that this is a matter that I can look into and ask the Cabinet Secretary the next time she's at the Senate to provide some background on why that would be the case.
For me to come in, Ramanyan, one, carbon trading is a very complex science. It is a market-based principle, which is also result-based, just like FLLoCA, that for companies to respond to the national determined contribution, which clearly indicates that it is national determined contribution towards reducing emission and towards adapting to the country. And that one is the same with the developed, what we call Annex 1 countries. So when you see a trading between two countries, one of the country must be developed. Why are we pairing the developed and developing? One, developed countries have been using old polluting technologies since 17th century. Now, for a country to shift from old polluting to green renewable technology, there is cost for additional investment. Now, when you take the calculation of the global greenhouse gas net emission at the global level, emissions come from the two sides, developed and developing, but it is more from the developed countries and it is less from the developing country. So, under the IPCC report, we capped for us to get 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, we need to cap emissions. Now, the science here is that country should have laid off the technologies can now support a company in Kenya, for example, because the emission here is low, so that it is a balance within the market.
Peter, let me just put something to you that was said by the former head of the African Development Bank, Kinome Adesina, when he left office last April. And I think you might have seen this interview that he gave to the Financial Times, where he basically said, look, that African countries are being shortchanged. Because to go back to what the senator said, if you're talking about a ton of carbon emissions, it is essentially the exact same product, regardless of whether it's coming from a forest in the DRC, whether it's coming from a Kenyan savanna, whether it's coming from some forest in Germany. It's the same thing. But it's going to cost $200 a ton for that emission credit in Europe. And those same companies can then come here and buy the exact same thing for $3 a ton. We are being shortchanged in that sense.
Damanyan, this is not a linear mathematical arithmetic. Look, there is two sides of carbon. There is voluntary carbon credit, where you enter two parties. Then there is regulated carbon credit market, the regulated market, where you are using the principles of the market, just like Nairobi Stock Exchange, capital markets authorities. We have to understand which kind of this trading is taking place. Is it taking on the voluntary, which is very bad, because in the voluntary market, where there is no regulation, where there is no oversight, is where such kind of prices, where these guys go and get it at 200 and then come and convince a few communities here to take $5 per ton. But that is what the Senate and us in the space have been doing. But we have to provide regulations to create a level playing ground to ensure that the markets, carbon markets, work for both the receiving country and also the emitting country.
As a starting point, then, can we bake it into our legislation, or rather our systems, our regulations for carbon trading, where we say, look, you can't come here and engage in that sort of arbitrage where you can buy an emission credit here for $20 a ton when the same thing will cost you $200 in Europe. There has to be a level of parity between those two prices.
Oh, correct. And that is what we have tried to correct with our carbon credit regulations is coming. And also we have changed the climate change law, as the Senator said. And that is why now we have 3 layers. There is the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change dealing with the policy and setting up authorization letter. That's to authorize you after faith. Then you go to NEMA, which is now the designated authority DNA, which now verifies all those sciences, all those markets, and give you a clean bill. And then after that, then now you go to the market. And now that market, the carbon trading market, is now at the National Treasury. And within the National Treasury, it is now our capital markets authority is the authority, because at the Treasury, we provide the physical policies and they now provide the market so that the loop is closed. And of course, I hope you saw how there was an issue here of cocoa. You heard cocoa was denied a letter of authorization. When you go deeper into those are the issues, because some organizations and some counties wanted to continue operating in this country as if the laws had not been in place. So when you read such things, that is the law that we have put is becoming effective, but we are strengthening them so that there is a level playing ground. But the unfortunate thing that KQs, these companies here, most held stocks in New York, would say, London. Now, some of these carbons with those companies like Shell is buying them in London. So we should not just accuse KQ or whatever, because when they go to the stock, this thing is linked from those global markets. And global markets have got their own principles, where market conditions are the key players. That is where the misfit is.
Okay, one more question. This one's coming from Samira Siblani. She will describe herself, I believe, as a reformed journalist. She's transitioning out of the trade, as it were. But this is directed to you, Senator Kajwan. And she's picking up on the argument that you made a little earlier. You said climate financing is a question of justice and not charity. But the counter argument she's making is that, look, a lot of Western countries can simply turn around and say, you know what? No, we're not actually paying anything. They will say the moral imperative that we're referring to is not something that they agree with. And we know we're dealing with governments in the United States right now, for example, where you've got climate deniers from the president all the way down the cabinet. So in that kind of scenario where governments that have an enormous pollution debt have been refusing to deal with climate financing, they're climate deniers, what do we then do as a country to fund our own mitigation and adaptation strategies?
Of course, one of the options would be for African countries to say to hell with it, and we go on with our lives. Unfortunately, the emissions coming from China, coming from the US, coming from Germany will still get to us because we live in one bubble. And so we don't have that option of saying to hell with it. Because you can say, I've planted all the trees that need to be planted. All my energy is produced in a renewable manner. I've got my carriers and my hydros. And so I'm good.
And in our case, 80% plus of our electricity is entirely renewable.
Is entirely renewable. So you can say, no, to hell with it, I don't care. But it is a global crisis. It is not a country-by-country crisis. So we can't afford not to care. Now, the rules-based order that has put this world together since the Great Wars, of course, is under threat. Multilateralism is under threat. We are speaking on a day when you don't know whether a nuclear bomb is going to be unleashed on Iran. And you don't know whether a country will decide that it becomes the super bully of the world. Of course, we are living in very unique times. But we believe that, and the commitments that we have seen in previous conference of parties, by and large, most of the nations on earth believe in multilateralism, They believe in the rules-based order. They believe in finding common approach and common solution to some of the problems facing the globe, rather than just waking up one day and deciding that you're the one with the solution. The situation we are in is quite unique. Of course, it's not the first time the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, or withdrawn from WHO, or withdrawn from ICC and all those kind of bodies. But most of the countries still believed that multilateralism is the way to go, and we must go rules-based, because at the end of the day, if we don't do that, what we are going to have is total anarchy. Now, if I was to chime in on, just to close in on the conversation on carbon markets and carbon trading, even in global negotiations, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is still problematic. And it is Article 6 that talks about carbon markets, carbon trading, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, the situation where a country that is a net polluter or a net emitter comes and buy credits from a country that is at net zero. So you find that there's a new form of carbon colonialism, where the oil-producing states, they offset their emissions by buying credit from countries like ours, countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you've seen Peter, who is an expert in this space, still describes it in very technical terms. For the people to understand it, it must be broken down into the simplest terms. Like that Maasai woman who asked me, what is the color of carbon and what is the smell of carbon and how can we contextualize it? So carbon trading, carbon markets, in as much as Kenya is a front runner, we have the legislation, we have the regulation, but the entire world is still grappling with it. And Article 6 is still a pain point in global negotiations.
Indeed. Quite a few more questions coming through from our audience. There's one here from Catherine Waithera, who's asked, what metrics are being used to ensure that the climate finance available actually does get to the most vulnerable informal settlement and arid counties? Peter, I think you can take that.
Oh, great, Catherine. There is, within the climate landscape, there is what we call the Rio markers, the OECD Rio markers. There is tracking of climate finance globally using the OECD markers, where the project and the investment must be defined as responding to climate adaptation or mitigation, and then start tracking that money from the source to the country and to where it goes. But now, when it comes into the country, the National Treasury in 2015, we are the first ever country in Africa to do what is called climate change coding, where you get the amount in our budget system under the IFMIS. Then within the IFMIS, there are codes. Now you have to take that money. You have to take the climate finance code. We call it segment 8 within the segments, how it moves up to the where it can now be tracked. So we are coding climate finance. We code it. Then we track it, how it moves from project activity. Then we report it, then we budget it, then based on the planning, then you now consolidate all the amount of money which is defined as over and above. Climate finance is not any money going to finance anything. Climate finance is defined by the UNFCCC that it is money which is provided over and above the developmental funds which should have otherwise been going into that. For example, FLLoCA is a true climate finance. Why? Because it is money that the counties are getting as additional resources to build the resilience of the water system, provide additional water sources, conserve the ecosystems, promote climate smart agriculture. Now, the difference between climate smart agriculture and conventional agriculture, that both conventional actions should go on, but the money provided over and above to step and to respond to climate change is the one which you account for. We have a system that is counting for that, and the project starts with the objective. The objective of FLLoCA is to strengthen the counties and national capacity and build local resilience to the impact of climate change. So once that objective is grabbed like that within the park, then automatically the whole amount under that program is classified as climate finance. But there are others for providing water, which is just business as usual. So those ones only a portion because it was not principal. So we are recording from the planning, budgeting, reporting, tracking, and reporting. So there is a tool for that. And we know, for example, in 2015, we had more than almost 200 billion, which the government put into climate actions. And we found that the government of Kenya is spending more to respond to climate change than the developed countries. But that is the obligation and the responsibility of the government. So you can go online and read Kenya Climate Finance Landscape 2021.
I'm going to combine two questions coming in. One of them is from IPF, and the other is from Samir Savlani, the journalist as well. And they're focusing on the implementation of the National Climate Change Fund. And essentially what the IPF was asking, Kenya's 2025 nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, in their view, shifting focus away from adaptation. A, they're asking why, and B, they're saying that the long-promised National Climate Change Fund is still unrealized. So why exactly is that happening, and can the Senate and the National Assembly hold the executive accountable? Senator Kajwang, I want you to go first, and then Peter.
Let me start with the last one on the Climate Change Fund. We've had two very unique challenges in implementing the Climate Change Act of Kenya. One, I think it was Section 5 that introduced the Climate Change Council, which was to be chaired by the president. And there were other players who would come in from civil society and from other mentioned groups. We've had a problem actualizing the Climate Change Council. Even as we speak, I wish Nidhika was on this call, but he's been in that space, knowing the challenges that civil society has had in terms of representation. So the Climate Change Council has not been effectively implemented, and as a result, the Climate Change Fund has also not been established. For the Climate Change Fund, all that needs to be done are regulations to be developed by the National Treasury and brought to Parliament for approval. But I think it requires leadership. So if the council is not yet functional, then it becomes also difficult to actualize the fund. But that should not be an excuse. I think the executive should explain to Parliament why an act of 2016 to date, 10 years down the line, the fund and the council have not been actualized. I think that was the last question that was asked. I didn't get the first one. If you could repeat.
The first question was from IPF, and they're saying that based on their reading, their assessment of our 2025 nationally determined contributions, we've essentially focused more on mitigation through large infrastructure projects rather than adaptation. And they're trying to understand why that change in focus has happened.
That would be contrary to the general policy. Perhaps when you break it down, it might lead to a different conclusion. But the policy, the position of Kenya, Africa, the developing countries, is that focus must be more on adaptation rather than on mitigation. Now, Kenya has been a leader in a way when it comes to mitigation, particularly on matters to do with renewable energy. Perhaps that's the reason why that comes out strongly in our national determined contributions. But by and large, our focus should be on adaptation, and even FLLoCA should generally push more towards adaptation rather than mitigation. And if that's an analysis that IPF has done, then I think that would be a useful feedback, because that then would fly in the face of the general philosophy that Kenya and African nations have taken. We must put more investments on adaptation. And that's why there was a push for the Adaptation Fund, which has not been properly effected. There was a push for the Loss and Damage Fund, which is yet to be properly effected. Our priority, our focus should be on adaptation. What sometimes happens with mitigation is that sometimes you find that there are donors or there are partners who are willing to put in money on mitigation initiatives or mitigation projects because they claim that they are more bankable as opposed to adaptation. But we must stick to the overall philosophy and the overall policy direction that African countries have taken.
For 1 minute, number one, just been said by the Senator, Kenyan NDC priority is adaptation. And that is clearly stated. Number two, it depends with the data set from the IPF. Mitigation projects like renewable energies, like geothermals, like wind, like solar, hydros, take long period for them to be completed and designed. So maybe some of the things we're now seeing in terms of cash flow, one projects which were designed in the last 10 years. So the focus, and that is why Kenya also reviewed our NDC, which we did in 2015 when we attended the Paris Agreement. Today, FLLoCA is adaptation-centric. 90% of the FLLoCA projects, the things that have been counting, are adaptation and not mitigation. Mitigation is given what is say the fifth component of the emerging issues, and it is only for renewable clean cooking within the household. And if you look at the $325 million US, 90% is adaptation. And that means that priority is shifting from mitigation, which would have got that big money for a 35 megawatt in geothermal or wind. Thirdly, the reason why that data set could be is because mitigation is business, adaptation is response, and providing services. So the companies, because 70% of the money you are seeing in climate change come from the private sector. So it is the private sector which are investing in renewable energy because of the mature technology that could be giving that data. But over and above, we are focusing on mitigation. So in number 2, one, the National Climate Change Fund, we had a draft regulation, which we did in 2017, 2018. But because of the challenges that the Senate very well articulated, could not move it. We have it. 2, because Section 25 of the Climate Change Act gave the National Treasury the power to set up the fund. But at the same section, contradicting himself, that goes ahead to indicate that the fund should be set up under the Climate Change Act. But the Public Finance Management Act 2012, with the amendments thereof, indicates clearly that all public funds, whether before or after the Public Finance Management Act, should be established under the Public Finance Management Act because it is robust and it is public funds. Now, in conclusion on this, because of those challenges, globally, the climate change funds have been overtaken by events. They are very small in nature. Rwanda for NERWA has only mobilized $30 million. FLLoCA only 4 hours mobilized 10 times that. Globally, people have moved to bigger financial institutions like Green Banks or Green Investment Bank, which is set up following the financial mechanisms. And the National Treasury, within the Green Fiscal Incentive Policy, it has already been approved to establish Kenya Green Investment Bank to respond to this in scale.
One last question / comment here that I'd like you to respond to, Senator Kajwang. This is from Anita Soina, and she's saying that based on some of the examples you gave earlier of county governments that were given funds from FLLoCA and then they did not use them in an appropriate manner, she says that essentially robs communities and vulnerable groups of the support they desperately need. And I guess the question would be, so once they've done this, and yes, the grant has been withheld, but beyond that, what else can be done to actually punish those involved? Is there any way of sanctioning these parties at a legislative level, at the Senate, when these county government representatives come to discuss their annual audits?
As much as we are talking of local level agreement on projects, there are also cases of local level collusion, where the communities sometimes will come up with a project that they know they'll figure out how to get the money back. And you have seen a few of those cases. Indeed, the World Bank, which has been a very visible partner in this, working very closely with Peter, has flagged some of this. But unfortunately, all they can do at this point, because it is a conditional grant, is to deal with breached conditions. The responsibility now lies with the Parliament and the county assemblies to ensure that the criminality of the breaches is pushed further. So yes, we agree that not much has been done to that extent. For example, when these counties, Kakamega, for example, was suspended from the grant, they were given an opportunity to make good. And some of them, what they do is that they move money from the special purpose account, because FLLoCA money is supposed to be ring-fenced. It's not supposed to be mixed with day-to-day expenditure. So sometimes when they've run out of cash and they're seeing there's money in FLLoCA accounts, they go and raid that account, use it for short-term manenos, and return it, or sometimes they don't return it. So we've seen the National Treasury come out strongly in those cases, giving a demand that the monies that have been raided must be refunded. But raiding a special purpose account is an offense under the Public Finance Management Act. So I think it is now for us in Parliament to make strong recommendations that those who do those kind of things, action is taken against them. And following public debate, you have seen some of us talk about raiding money meant for country aggregation and industrial parks, using it for border events, and defining it as a crime. So raiding money meant for FLLoCA to use for other purposes is an offense. And perhaps with time, given 2-3 years, because this is still fairly new, and a lot of things, we are sailing the boat as we are building it. But I agree with Anita that action should be taken to deal with the criminal elements that sometimes crop up. But largely, this program had been much more successful. Previously, the World Bank had a program in county governments. It was called NARI, National Agriculture something. It has been replaced by NAV-CDP. It had serious problems. And I think it is from those lessons that they designed FLLoCA. Or you cannot design out integrity issues, but those ones, I agree that Parliament must give strong recommendations.
Now, but can I come just here very briefly?
Yes, by all means.
The senators have done a fantastic job. Let me give you an example where we are visiting counties one by one, where first of all, I am called as a friend of the Senate committees of the finance, environment, and whatever. I've not been to Kajua. One, we stopped the account, but now it is now personal responsibility. Immediately it is stopped. Then all the loopholes are sealed, and then the EFC takes the matter for criminality because the person who messed or removed that money from the SPA is not my grandmother. It is either a chief officer, a director, or somebody else. Now, the Senate has given clear direction. Now, we were down somewhere in the coast, and one of the judges said it is criminal offense, and we found you moved 28.5 million, and this matter is being referred to EFC, DCI, and by the way, a number of counties have written statements. So wait for the good day to come. It is working.
There's a couple of things that I think we can take out from this conversation. So first of all, I think we do need to put the teams from IPF with their studies together in the same room with Peter. Hopefully, if we can get Senator Kajwang, can get time in your schedule, that'll be fantastic. So we can have this discussion in a bit more detail and drill down on some of the observations that IPF pointed out. Of course, we don't take the engagement between policymakers and ourselves as taxpayers, as citizens for granted. So this is something that needs to continue going on in the long run. I'd like to say a massive thank you. It's been a pretty interesting discussion with Senator Moses Kajwang, the Senator for Homa Bay and the convener of the Senate Climate Change Caucus, and of course, Peter Odengo, who's the head of climate finance and green economy at the National Treasury and the program coordinator for FLLoCA. Hopefully, this will be the first of a series of conversations around key policy issues brought to you by the team at Mongo Capital. My thanks to you, gentlemen, and of course to everyone who's tuned into this space tonight. Have a fantastic evening, and we'll see you in the next one.